Okay, exploding pagers.
Mhm.
I got to admit, when I first saw those headlines about Lebanon, I thought, is this for real? Like, who even USES pagers anymore?
Right. It does sound a little blast from the past, like something out of a Cold War spy film.
Exactly.
But the thing is, looking into these articles, it's clear this is serious stuff.
Yeah, this is just the tip of the iceberg, really. We're doing a deep dive today into the conflict, the escalating conflict, I should say, between Israel and Hezbollah. We've got 3 articles we're looking at, each one kind of giving us a different angle on what could be, well, the start of something much bigger, a much wider war.
And it's a conflict, it's already proving deadly for civilians too. That first article, the one with the title Hezbollah Walkie-Talkies Explode in Lebanon in Second Day of Blasts, it really paints a stark picture of what's happening on the ground there.
This article, they don't hold back on the details either. We're talking descriptions of like fire-damaged cars, victims, bloodied victims. One of the devices even went off during a funeral.
Oh, gosh.
It's heartbreaking,
Oh.
honestly. And it really hits home, the very real human cost of what's going on. At least 32 people dead, and that includes children and thousands more injured.
And that's where the real tragedy is, right? It's easy to get caught up in all the geopolitics, the military strategy, but ultimately this boils down to people's lives being destroyed.
It's true. It's easy to lose sight of that when you're, looking at maps and casualty figures and all that. But let's talk about Hezbollah for a sec. How does a group that's using tech that seems, frankly, kind of outdated, we're talking pagers here, how do they still present such a serious threat?
Well, that's actually a key part of it, you see. It's about operational security. Pagers are really hard to intercept, which makes it that much more difficult for, say, Israeli intelligence to track their communications. But this attack, it kind of throws a wrench in that.
That makes sense, but it also brings up a lot of questions. Like,
Uh,
they keep mentioning remote detonation, but what does that even mean in this context? What kind of tech are we talking about? And what about the psychological impact of this kind of warfare, to have the very tools you rely on turned into, weapons against you?
Absolutely. It adds a whole other layer of fear of uncertainty. You're a Hezbollah fighter, you're out there, and you have to wonder, is the next time I use my radio, is that it?
It's like a nightmare scenario.
Yeah, it is.
And that kind of leads us perfectly into that second article we wanted to get to, Israel's reckless pager attack on Hezbollah.
Mhm.
And this writer does not mince words. This is a very direct criticism of Netanyahu's whole strategy here.
It's being called reckless, yeah. And Netanyahu's being accused of essentially poking the bear, intentionally provoking Hezbollah, and, risking a much larger conflict in the process.
There was this one quote that really jumped out at me,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm quoting here, Netanyahu increasingly seems bent on either goading Hezbollah into an all-out war or prompting a reaction that Israel would use to justify a land offensive into Lebanon. Are we really at the point of suggesting that Netanyahu might actually want a wider war?
Well, to get that, we have to look at the man's situation right now. Politically, he's under a lot of pressure domestically. He's got the fallout from the recent Hamas attacks, and then, of course, his ongoing corruption trials.
So a wag the dog scenario.
Yes.
Create a war to distract from problems at home.
It's possible, right? Definitely not something to be dismissed out of hand. I mean, we've seen leaders throughout history resort to similar tactics. That being said, there could be other motivations at play here as well.
Okay, so let's break those down. What else could be behind this aggressive approach?
Well, Netanyahu, he's always been really hawkish on Hezbollah, seeing them as like an existential threat to Israel. He might actually believe that a decisive military victory, even if it's unlikely, is the only way to really, neutralize them for good.
But a ground invasion into Lebanon, that's a whole other level. Wouldn't that risk an even bigger fight? Maybe even drag Iran into it?
It absolutely would. And that's what makes this whole approach so reckless. The article makes it really clear. Hezbollah, they're not Hamas. It's a totally different ballgame. This is a highly organized, well-equipped force, and they're deeply entrenched in Lebanon. An invasion wouldn't be over quickly. It would be long, drawn out, a lot of blood spilled, heavy costs all around.
And then you've got Iran in the background, right? The article mentions that too.
Right, exactly. Iran has been backing Hezbollah for a long time, giving them weapons, money, training. They've made it clear they're not going to just sit back and watch if Israel invades. We could easily be talking about a regional war, and that could be devastating.
It's scary to think, like one wrong move, one miscalculation from either side, and suddenly it explodes into something so much bigger.
Yeah, no, you're right. And that kind of brings us to that last article, the one titled, Pentagon Worries Israel is Close to Launching Ground War in Lebanon. This one gives us a look at how the U.S. is viewing this whole situation, how tense things are getting, and honestly, they are worried.
Yeah, seriously worried from the sound of it. They're saying it's like extremely volatile, very high chance of things going completely off the rails.
And it's not just talk either. They're moving military assets into the region.
Yeah.
A carrier group, Marines, even F-22s, they're not doing that for no reason. It's a very deliberate signal to Israel, to the entire region, really, that they're taking this incredibly seriously.
It's like if you read between the lines, it's like a checklist, right, for what happens right before things go bad. Kind of chilling when you think about it.
Yeah.
They even quote some unnamed officials from the U.S. using phrases like spiraling out of control. Not very reassuring, is it?
Not at all, no. There's definitely a feeling that time is running out, like they might not be able to keep a lid on things for much longer. The article does mention some diplomatic efforts to kind of bring the temperature down a bit, but knowing Netanyahu, how he operates, it's hard to be optimistic, to be honest.
So let me ask you, why is the U.S. so invested in all of this and what happens between these two? I mean, I get the alliance with Israel, but what's the bigger picture here, strategically speaking?
Well, for the U.S., it's bigger than just Israel, you know. It's about maintaining their influence, their presence in the Middle East as a whole. And they see Israel as like essential, a key ally in a region that's, well, pretty volatile, let's be honest. Kind of a check against Iranian influence, you could say.
Right, a buffer.
Exactly. And a wider war, especially one that, pulls Iran in, that would be a huge problem for U.S. interests. It could completely destabilize the whole region. And then you've got the ripple effects, right? We could be talking global energy markets, terrorism, all sorts of things.
So they're really walking a tightrope here, trying to keep a lid on an ally that honestly seems pretty gung-ho about escalating things, while also at the same time trying to prevent like a full-blown regional meltdown. Not an easy position to be in.
Not at all. And through all of this, we can't forget the human cost. Sadly, it often gets kind of pushed aside when we talk about this stuff, the geopolitics of it all. But we're talking about real people, millions of them, in Israel, in Lebanon, the whole region, really. Those are the people who'd suffer the most if this blows up.
It's true. It's easy to get caught up in the military analysis, the political maneuvering, but at the end of the day, it's the human cost that really matters. So looking at all this, from every angle we can find, I got to ask, is there any hope here? Can we realistically avoid a bigger war at this point?
I wouldn't say it's like inevitable, but it's going to be really, really close. It'll take a level of diplomacy, of restraint that, frankly, we haven't seen a lot of so far.
Yeah.
Both sides need to step back from the edge, and that's not going to be easy.
What would that even look like at this point? Like, concretely, what needs to happen to stop this thing from spinning totally out of control?
It has to start with international pressure, and that means putting pressure on Netanyahu specifically. The U.S., they have a lot of leverage with Israel, but are they willing to use it? And I don't just mean saying diplomacy is important. They need to lay down the law, make it crystal clear that further escalation has serious consequences.
And Hezbollah, what about them? What's their role in all of this, in de-escalating the situation?
They're not innocent bystanders, obviously, but they've also said they don't want a full-scale war. The big question is, are they willing to give a little to back down, but in a way that, lets Netanyahu save face?
That feels like the million-dollar question right there.
Yeah.
Both sides are kind of, locked in this standoff, each one waiting for the other to blink first.
Exactly. And the longer that goes on, the more likely it is that someone misreads something, Some small thing, a misunderstanding maybe, suddenly spirals out of control, and then it's anyone's guess what happens.
We've gone deep on this one today, haven't we? Exploding pagers, talk of all-out war. We've looked at what's motivating the key players, what the international community is afraid of, and the very real possibility that a lot of innocent people are going to pay the price for all this.
We have. And while I don't have any easy answers, I think the most important thing is that we don't stop asking the tough questions, that we all stay informed, stay engaged. Because what happens over there, it matters to all of us, whether we realize it or not.
Couldn't agree more. This isn't some far-off conflict that doesn't concern us. What happens here is going to have an impact. It's a good reminder that we're all connected, and choices made by leaders, even if they're thousands of miles away, they can have a real impact on all of our lives.